Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's show once again with the latest COVID-19 tally. So far, the virus has infected nearly 4 to 5 million people across the world and killed more than 300,000, according to Johns Hopkins University. The pandemic has cast a pall over the global economy. Many countries are cautiously emerging from a lockdown, but life is unlikely to return to normal until a vaccine is found. According to World Health Organization, more than 70 potential vaccines are in the pipeline. All of them are at various development stages. There are usually 3 stages, by the way, with a race against time to defeat the virus. A top EU medicines agency says in the best case scenario, a vaccine could be ready by early next year. So how far are we from a potent vaccine? With the World Health Assembly just around the corner, earlier I talked to Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, for more insights. Dr. Kim, a lot of new development regarding the vaccine candidates. Which ones are likely to be more helpful for all of us looking at the potential?
Vaccine testing in humans has 3 phases. Phase 1, primarily for safety. Phase 2, primarily to look to see whether the right protective responses are being generated. And then Phase 3, which is the real proof that the vaccine actually works and protects human beings and is safe. It's a little tricky because some of these vaccines are in Phase 1/2, so it's hard to tell exactly where they are. But basically, they're enrolling hundreds to 1,000 or so patients to try to see whether the vaccine is actually creating the right kind of protective responses. Right. And, you know, in the end, if it's a group from China or a group from Canada or a group from, Korea that develops a vaccine, it'll be good for us, for mankind, for humankind. And I think that's the goal. Sometimes we get too engaged in the race, and we don't kind of see that in the end, we're doing this for humanity.
We hope everybody is looking at that goal and that goal alone. Having said that, though, there are difficulties ahead, particularly regarding the 3rd stage of trials that you just mentioned, which would involve many more people and on a much bigger scale. Dr. Kim, tell me more about that.
So the 3rd phase is actually the most kind of technically complicated and also the most expensive. Yeah. In that kind of trial, we take a certain number of people, and the number of people is actually chosen very carefully. If we know that there's a lot of COVID-19 infections going on in a country or in a city, we can actually choose a relatively smaller, we can do a relatively smaller trial. If we, for instance, think that the rate of infection has dropped off significantly, then we have to expand the trial. So in a trial that I did once, we involved 16,400 adults, and that's a fair number. If the number of infections is higher, then you can probably get away with 3,000, 4,000, or 5,000. But it really depends on how many infections you have in an area. Yeah. So for instance, right now, it would be difficult to test a vaccine in Phase 3 in Korea or in China, because the number of infections is so small that you would have to have a trial that had tens of thousands, 100,000 people, and that wouldn't be efficient. Those kinds of trials take much longer to enroll, to get the volunteers together for, and it makes interpretation of information a little more complex.
Cooperation, therefore, become extremely important. Recently, we have been informed by the news that China and Canada, some of the private companies are working together about that. So what do you make of cooperation like this? How much is it likely to help with the original goal you just mentioned, Dr. Kim, to serve humanity?
As a vaccine developer, I mean, we work all over the world. This is a disease that occurs in the wealthiest countries and in poor countries, 187 countries or more now around the world. So as we're thinking about this, we have to be designing trials that involve multiple organizations, that involve cooperation and collaboration. There's an organization called CEPI. Having all the experience, having the benefit of multiple partners will allow them to move a vaccine forward for humanity, for the world. And I think that it would be an important gesture, a very important symbol, both of the fact that Chinese vaccines are advancing now and are among the most advanced in the world, but also because we all realize that this is an exercise. This phase 3 trial should involve people around the world, and data that is going to be shared and shared openly as we know that the vaccine works and protects and is safe.
Let me ask you also about cooperation. Sanofi, which is a company, a global company, recently have been talking about its vaccine candidate, and it's very promising. And yet, the CEO recently revealed to the public, suggesting that the U.S. will have it first, as a result of a so-called a specific organization within the United States related to the government be providing funding for the research of the vaccine. Of course, French government is very upset about that, and later the board chair of Sanofi changed the original tune of the company's comments. So, but tell me more about that. So what does that mean? Whoever provides the funding, what rights and what limits should they consider? And when it comes to international cooperation and sharing of the vaccines and what you talk about as humanity, where should we look at?
So a very complicated and political question, but one that is really critical. So when we look at the groups that can fund vaccines around the world, the U.S. and China with their large scientific establishments and for research, are able to put significant quantities of money behind certain companies, whether it's Sanofi or whether it's Moderna or CureVac, which is an RNA company located in Germany. Countries will try to fund them, so U.S. or China, for instance, and as a consequence of that funding, the contract will often say, and for this funding, as a result of the funding that we're giving you, when and if there is a vaccine, then we have the right to a certain amount of it, and that's a part of the funding contract. That's frequently, it's done for flu vaccines, it's done for other kinds of vaccines, and so for the United States to do that is not unusual in the context of COVID, where we know that it's a global problem, that's causing hundreds of thousands of infections and deaths. It doesn't look right. For the Sanofi CEO to say that, he's a businessman. And China is funding its own companies to do this. Will the vaccine go, when and if we have a vaccine, the first 10 million doses will probably, and I don't want to put a country into a corner, but the country that pays for the research will probably want to have that vaccine first to protect its people. I mean, a country's interests are usually the protection of its people. How will it work in the end? We're not sure. Yeah. But I think that this is the time for countries to start talking to each other about how to prioritize the use of vaccine when and if an effective COVID-19 vaccine is available.
Recently, for example, Dr. Kim, we have seen finger pointing coming from the United States toward China about the so-called hacking related to vaccine development. Now, there are a lot of accusations the U.S. has about China recently, almost 3 or 4 every day being manufactured, and usually without much evidence, this time too. So how should we understand? I'm not trying to put you into a geopolitical game, because your job is not about that. Your job is a scientist. But how should we understand the ever complicated circumstances? This is just one of those examples that countries that are front runners are finger pointing at each other or at the other, trying to suggest that you are getting ahead because you're not doing well. But actually, realities could be a very different thing. Dr. Kim.
The first responsibility of a country is to protect its people. And when the outbreak was raging in China, or when it was raging in Korea, the response of the government was first to protect the people. And you want that. Yeah. The second part of what the governments can do is that they can fund vaccine research or research in drugs that will help to treat people who are infected with COVID. That's the second response. All of the other things you should consider noise. the first responsibility is to protect the people. Developing a vaccine, developing new drugs, using science for the benefit of people within China, within Korea, or people around the world is really the focus. We shouldn't get distracted. We should continue to work on vaccines and development. And we should think about how we're going to do this together rather than to think about who's going to get there first. We're doing this for a reason. So really, remember, there are 3 phases to vaccine development: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
Yeah.
And if we had 5 to 10 years to make this vaccine, which we don't, the last phase, during phase 3, a company is usually building new factories or gearing up to manufacture the vaccine in significant quantity, because once the phase 3 trial shows that the vaccine works and the regulatory agency approves the vaccine, the company wants to sell it in order to recoup some of the costs to make profit. We only have 12 to 18 months, which means that as we are talking now, organizations like the Gates Foundation and CEPI, some of the companies involved are looking for partners who can manufacture the vaccine when and if it's shown to be effective.
Right.
But we're going to need a network of these manufacturers probably distributed around the world because, in the end, 7 billion people will need to get this vaccine.
Yes.
And what if we need 2 doses of the vaccine? That's 14 billion doses. No one company is going to be able to make all of that. So we're going to have to think now about how we're going to make a vaccine available, how we're going to make the vaccine, and then how we're going to use the vaccine to vaccinate all 7 billion people in the world. So again, these are things, and the thinking has to start now. We don't have the luxury of 5 to 10 years to ponder and wonder what we're going to do when we have the vaccine. We know if this vaccine works and it is effective, there's going to be a huge demand for it. So let's start thinking about how we're going to make it and how we're going to use it equitably and give access to people around the world.
Dr. Kim beautifully said as a scientist, but some people are just trying to distract us every day with things that it is not relevant to saving lives. In your chair, what can you do? And how do you talk to your peers, your colleagues, your friends, and your fellow scientists about all of this?
So, the scientific community, I think, is pretty clearly behind the idea that we focus on the work. We understand the virus. We understand how it hurts people, because that is all going to help us understand how to make better medicines, how to make monoclonal antibodies that will shorten the duration of infection or keep people from going on ventilators.
Indeed.
That is a focus. We focus on the vaccine because we know we only have 12 to 18 months, because for every extra month we take, there are additional infections and deaths. So we're able to focus, and we focus on the science and the data. The distractions are troubling. But again, countries need to focus the same way scientists do. They need to protect their people. They need to put into place effective programs that limit the spread of the infection, that keep people out of the hospital, that preserve the lives of their citizens. That is what a country does. And so everyone needs to focus. Countries on what they're supposed to do, and scientists and vaccine developers like me on what we're supposed to do.